In the mist-covered alleyways of medieval Castbourne, a fictional kingdom eerily resembling 13th-century England, the River Thorn drifted quietly past crooked alleys and cobbled courtyards, carrying whispers of rebellion and vengeance. Within this murky world of betrayal and divine monarchy, the crown forged its most horrifying instrument of justice, the punishment of being hanged, gutted, and divided. A spectacle so violent it would define terror for generations. This execution method was first fully recorded under King Aldrich III in 1241. It arose from a belief that high betrayal, an offense not only against the throne but against divine, cosmic order, was a sin beyond redemption. This punishment did not merely end life. It erased a man from dignity, family, and history itself. The first known victim to suffer this fate in its entirety was Garrick Morland, a rogue seafarer executed for piracy. His death marked a turning point, an era where disobedience became a slow, brutal warning to all who dared question royal command. His punishment wasn't about justice. It was about domination through agony. The roots of this barbaric sentence trace back even further to the Iron Dominion's conquest of 1066, when Lord Varick the Conqueror installed an unforgiving feudal system demanding unwavering loyalty. Historical scrolls written by chroniclers such as Brother Hadrian of Blackwell Abbey reveal that even mild criticism of royal decisions could be construed as treason. One such victim was Edric of Althorn, condemned in 1076 for defending a man already executed for alleged treason. All Edric had done was suggest the man had been wrongly accused. Yet this lone sentence was deemed an act of disloyalty. He was arrested and executed without trial, his lands confiscated, his lineage erased. In the decades following the conquest, accusations of betrayal became widespread. The infamous Doomsday Ledgers recorded over 100 instances of seized estates, entire families punished for the missteps of one member. The throne grew obsessed with unity through terror. But it was the execution of Prince Daric ap Garin, the last sovereign of the Wild Highlands, that cemented the ritual of hanging, gutting, and division as the ultimate punishment. In 1283, Daric was dragged through the streets by the tail of a dying horse, hanged until nearly breathless, then cut down while still alive. His stomach was sliced open, and his organs burned before his fading eyes. His body was quartered, each segment sent to the furthest cities of the realm: Eldermore, Stonecross, Holwich, and North Point. His head was displayed atop the Crimson Bridge beside his brothers, ending the legacy of independent Highland rule. This execution became legend, not because of its horror, but because of its precision. Before such punishments became standardized, traitors met an array of grim fates. The Old Codex of Thorns, an ancient scroll from the Isles of Farron, describes how enemies of the throne were once buried alive, thrown into pits of serpents, or burned in sacred groves. The Stormborn Raiders, ancestors to the Castbourne nobility, were said to have practiced the ritual of the Iron Falcon, a gruesome tradition where a man's back was torn open and his lungs pulled out like wings. Such legends, though shrouded in myth, echoed the same theme: rebellion would be repaid in blood. When the Iron Dominion's customs took hold, executions became more public, more theatrical. In 1096, Luther of Uxmere, a noble plotting against the young King Hadric, was blinded with heated daggers and castrated on the steps of the temple. This punishment, equal parts pain, humiliation, and spectacle, became the crown's favorite script. From these roots of fear and fire, the punishment of hanging, gutting, and division rose like a cursed ritual. It was not just justice, it was a royal curse spoken through flesh. And in the centuries to follow, the crown would wield it not just to punish, but to remind the world who truly ruled. After the unrelenting grip of Lord Varick, the Conqueror established dominion over Castbourne's fertile lands in 1066. The realm saw a transformation not just in borders, but in how it dealt with defiance. Every whisper of rebellion, every flicker of dissent was met with suspicion, and often steel. The foundations of the brutal punishment known as hanging, gutting, and division were not born overnight. They evolved from centuries of fear-tinged governance, shaped by blood and politics. By the late 11th century, even minor opposition to royal authority could be construed as treason. In the ancient annals known as the Scrolls of the Hundred Scepters, chroniclers like Abbot Thedrin of North Hill documented chilling examples of overreach. In 1087, Owen of Balderin, a local scribe, was executed merely for saying that Earl Malric, a noble accused of conspiracy, was innocent. For this simple claim, Owen was declared a traitor and buried alive near the walls of the Iron Court. His land was taken, his family exiled. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was generational. The Crown, determined to extinguish any ember of revolt, began cataloging acts of treason with frightening efficiency. The dread registers of the realm, compiled under Queen Ilara's high justiciars, showed more than 100 recorded land seizures from those branded enemies of the throne during the 1100s. Each entry bore the same chilling mark: for betrayal of the sovereign will. But it wasn't until the execution of Prince Diric ap Garen, heir of the Highland throne, that the punishment was unleashed in its full ritual form. His trial, if one could call it that, was held under armed guard in a sealed chamber within Cragmore Fortress. Witnesses were forbidden. His sentence was predetermined. Chronicler brother Alric of Grey Hollow, who secretly observed from a concealed balcony, later described the scene in grim detail. Diric was tied by the wrists to a cart, dragged from Cragmore through the icy stone, roads of Sharrow, bleeding from head wounds inflicted earlier by guards. His limbs were lashed so tightly that blood oozed from the skin, soaking the horse's flanks as they pulled him to the execution yard. Once at the gallows, he was hoisted by the neck, not to die, but to suffer. The drop was short, just enough to choke him, but not enough to kill. As he writhed, he was cut down and thrown onto a blood-stained bench. There, the royal executioner, a man known only as Carrick the Blade, used a hooked blade to slice open Diric's abdomen. His entrails were pulled out slowly, inch by inch, and set ablaze in a brazier before his eyes. He screamed until his voice broke into gurgled gasps, but it didn't end there. His body was then quartered, limbs severed and torso split, each piece wrapped in salt and linen. His quarters were sent to Eldermore in the north, Stonecross in the east, Holwich in the south, and North Point along the icy frontier. His head, placed upon a pike dipped in tar, joined that of his brother Luther ap Garen on Crimson Bridge, overlooking the River Thorn. A final warning to all would-be rebels. Before this macabre spectacle became the crown's standard, execution practices varied. Ancient tribal rituals across the Stormreach clans included being cast into snake pits or burned in groves sacred to forgotten gods. The Seakin of Morvain reportedly practiced the Iron Falcon, a torturous rite where a man's ribs were broken outward and lungs pulled through the back, though modern scholars question whether this ritual truly occurred or was legend born of terror. Yet these primitive customs paled in comparison to what Castborn would refine into state-sanctioned horror. Under the influence of Varric's descendants, execution became not just a penalty, it became performance. In 1096, a high-born knight named Sir Calin of Uxmere, accused of plotting against King Hadric, was publicly mutilated. His eyes were burned from their sockets with heated iron. His manhood was removed and cast into the crowd, where it was trampled underfoot. No record exists of his final words, only that his screams echoed for over an hour. From these dark origins, the punishment of hanging, gutting, and division emerged as more than a sentence. It was a crown-forged spectacle, an engineered message in blood. To defy the throne was to be destroyed utterly, body, soul, and memory. By the dawn of the 14th century, Castborn had turned punishment into both a political weapon and an art of intimidation. The brutality of public executions had become so deeply embedded in the kingdom's legal framework that even slight defiance was met with overwhelming force. Yet it was the formalization of this savagery that gave it unprecedented power. In 1351, under the reign of King Ulrich the Just, the dreaded law of royal betrayal, Castborn's version of the Treason Act, was sealed with a blood-red insignia. It did not merely define treason, It declared war on the traitor's body. But the law wasn't equally applied. It was strategically performed. Take the infamous case of Sir Alwyn Brant, a noble knight and former advisor to Queen Lysandra, executed in 1400 for alleged conspiracy to overthrow her regent. His crime? Hosting secret meetings with scholars who opposed the crown's religious decrees. According to archivist Darren Mallory, who recorded the proceedings in the Chronicles of the Fall, Sir Alwyn was dragged through the market district of Caerwyn, hanged by a custom-built gallows until semi-conscious, then revived with vinegar-soaked rags. He was made to sit upright, forced to watch as his own entrails were extracted and burned in a cauldron of oil placed before him. As his intestines blackened in the fire, he muttered his last words, "Blessed be this day, for I still have breath to defy you." These weren't punishments. They were messages delivered in screams, but one needn't conspire with noble blood to face such horror. In 1381, during the infamous Harvest Rebellion, a lowly preacher named Brother Jonan Bale was executed for preaching that all men were equal in the eyes of the divine flame. His most famous sermon echoed through the fields of Eastreach. When first fire burned, no one was lord and no one was serf. For this he was hunted, captured, and sentenced. Jonan's death was swift compared to others, his limbs bound and quartered within hours, but the symbolism remained potent. His charred heart was nailed to the church doors of Northmere as a declaration. Spiritual rebellion would be punished as harshly as political defiance. Religion, in fact, became the crown's favorite justification for cruelty. The High Temple, led by Archbishop Seraphin Langley, declared that the divine right of kings was not merely doctrine, but holy law. Thus, defying the monarch meant defying the gods themselves. Under this sacred pretext, torture became divine justice. It was ordained suffering, and the clergy's presence at executions added an air of sacred finality to each violent act. No one embodied this twisted morality more than Elder Roderick Murr, a former spiritual counselor turned accused dissenter. In 1475, after he questioned King Ulrich's claim to divine voice, he was condemned. Though once honored in the royal court, his stature couldn't shield him from the gallows. His final words, recorded in the temple archives, "I die the king's servant, but the flames first." This ritualistic execution became known as the divine unmaking. It set a new precedent for religiously motivated punishment. As the body was defiled, the soul, according to royal priests, was being purged of its treason before death. Witnesses to Elder Murr's death claimed the executioners sang psalms while removing his organs, a grotesque parody of sacred rites. These spectacles were not only seen, they were remembered. Records show that more than 5,000 villagers gathered at the fields of Atherwyn to witness the execution of Sir Cedric Thorne in 1394. His crime being the refusal to recognize the crown's latest edict over temple offerings. Children were brought by parents to witness what was called the cleansing of traitors. The high priest at the time claimed such visions would instill courage and loyalty in the young. Executions had evolved. They were no longer just tools of discipline. They had become instruments of state mythology, combining law, religion, and fear into one merciless ritual. Through fire and steel, the crown declared this truth: your body is not your own. Your loyalty is your only sanctuary. By the mid-14th century, Castbourne had transformed the execution field into something more than a place of justice. It became a theater of horror, a stage upon which the crown enacted its most terrifying warnings. Each performance was meticulously orchestrated, drawing the eyes and trembling hearts of thousands. These spectacles were not just to punish, they were to burn memory into flesh and fire into rumor. The most infamous of these theaters was the Hollow Post, an execution ground at the edge of the capital where the condemned were paraded like beasts before the blade. Here, Sir Ronan Mailer, accused lover of Queen Isadora and usurper of state secrets, met his end in 1330. His death became the template for ceremonial brutality. The procession to the gallows took 3 hours, deliberately slow and torturous. At each of 5 prescribed stops through the city, Heralds read aloud a different charge against him. At every stop, Sir Ronan was crowned with a new mock crown, one of thorns, one of soot, one of rat bones, one of broken glass, and finally, a crown made of nettles dipped in salt. These cruel symbols mocked his supposed desire to steal the throne. The crowd, swelling into the tens of thousands, followed with jeers, flung refuse, and chants scripted by the royal ministry. Children rode on their fathers' shoulders. Merchants sold death sweets, candied apples shaped like skulls. It was a carnival of cruelty. Witnesses reported that at the final platform, before being eviscerated, Sir Ronan looked toward the tower of Arden and whispered, "She weeps not, then let the steel kiss me instead." But it was not just royalty who met this gruesome stage. Hayden Desh, a radical herbalist and philosopher, was executed in 1326 for publishing scrolls questioning the king's divine visions. His punishment was designed not just to kill, but to humiliate. He was forced to wear a reverse-painted tabard bearing his family's coat of arms upside down, marking him as a traitor to his bloodline. During the slow march, women in the crowd threw ash and rotted bread at him. Records from the scribe of Eldenwatch, who stood among the onlookers, describe how Desh remained silent, his face streaked with soot and dignity. Even as the executioners peeled the skin from his chest and burned his intestines, he did not scream, only locked eyes with the clergy, who watched from a golden balcony. The execution of Lyric Branner in 1605, one of the conspirators behind the Nightfire plot, brought new psychological tactics to the stage. Authorities placed the scaffold in a manner that allowed the traitors to watch one another die, in perfect order. Lyric, bound in chains, was fourth in line. He witnessed the hanging and disemboweling of his three closest comrades before being dragged forward himself. The chief interrogator, Warden Elric Dane, famously said during the trial, "A desperate disease demands a desperate remedy." This phrase became the motto etched onto the iron door of Judicators' Hall, where all treason trials were held for the next 50 years. In this era, the role of the executioner became paradoxical, both hated and respected. They were artists of agony, and their tools were instruments of legacy. Master Cédin Vole, the realm's most famed executioner during the reign of King Theron, was known for his ability to keep victims conscious throughout the procedure. He earned 72 crowns per quartering, 6 months' wages for a high craftsman. He used a set of knives handed down from his grandfather, each with a name: Mercy, Truth, Last Light, Breaker, and Judgment. Vole's apprentice, Bryn Mora, recorded in his journal that these blades were oiled with hemlock sap and sharpened before every display, while hymns were sung in reverse tones to bless the steel. Heads were not merely severed, they were preserved, painted, and paraded. The Crimson Bridge overlooking the Capitol bore dozens of spiked heads at any given time. They were salt-boiled, coated in black tar, and impaled on iron poles as a deterrent to foreign emissaries and locals alike. In 1535, Lady Elira Montaigne's head remained displayed for 29 days before her daughter bribed a bridge guard to steal it under moonlight. She preserved it in lavender and kept it beside her bed until her death. The stage was sacred, brutal, and precise. It was designed to break the body, yes, but more importantly, it was engineered to etch fear into the mind of every witness. The message was clear. In Castborn, to defy the throne was not merely to die, it was to be unmade. By the time the punishment of hanging, gutting, and division reached its grisly peak in Castborn, it had evolved into a chilling ritual of calculated anatomy, an intersection of torture, tradition, and surgical precision. It was not enough to kill a traitor. The execution had to break them, layer by layer, while an audience bore witness. And for that, the executioner had to be more than a brute, he had to be an artist of agony. On a frostbitten morning in 1569, a man named Joram Felwyn was dragged to the execution stage in St. Varen's Square. His alleged crime? Assassination of a royal envoy. But it was his death, not his deeds, that would be remembered as a masterclass in cruel craftsmanship. Dragged by a wooden hurdle for over an hour through Castbourne's filthy back streets, Felwyn's body was battered before the punishment even began. But this was not incidental. The jarring journey over cobblestone was meant to weaken the condemned and offer the crowd a spectacle before the true horror commenced. The scaffold, carefully constructed at dawn, stood tall like a monument to terror. Its wood was scrubbed clean, ropes tested for tensile strength. The executioner that day, known only as Boran the Red, was renowned for keeping his victims alive longer than any man before him. His name was whispered across the kingdom like a curse passed down. The first phase, the short drop hanging, was carefully engineered. Unlike the long drop method designed to break the neck instantly, this version allowed the victim to strangle slowly, gasping for air. The rope, soaked overnight in vinegar, resisted stretching, allowing precise control of pressure on the throat. Felwyn convulsed for over 3 minutes before being cut down, semi-conscious but very much alive. Then came the gutting, or drawing. It required more than brute strength. It demanded exact anatomical knowledge. Using a curved blade known as the moon slicer, the executioner sliced from sternum to pelvis, careful to avoid major arteries. The purpose was not to kill, but to ensure maximum visibility and pain. Executioners like Boran passed down their methods through bloodlines. His family had kept a journal of techniques, a blood-stained tome called the Red Grimoire, recording ideal incision depths, organ exposure timings, and breathing thresholds. According to this gruesome manual, the first cut, made with the blade nicknamed Mercy, was meant to shock the nervous system, but not destroy it. Felwyn's organs were removed one by one. His small intestine first, then the stomach, then the liver. Each organ was displayed to the crowd before being tossed into a cauldron of boiling pitch, placed within his line of sight. All while he remained aware, twitching, moaning, and unable to scream. Mirrors were sometimes used in high-profile executions, carefully arranged so that the condemned could witness their own disembowelment. Lady Myra Solon, executed in 1541, was subjected to this technique. 3 mirrors, polished daily by apprentice executioners, reflected her own agony back at her until her eyes rolled back in horror. The practice became standard for nobles deemed especially arrogant. Then came the quartering, the final desecration. The body, still warm, was methodically severed at the joints. Knives were used for tendons, but the actual splitting required heavy cleavers and saws. Boran the Red was said to use a double-grip axe, its iron edge blessed by both a priest and a judge. He began at the knees, then the hips, then shoulders. The torso was cleaved last down the spine. Each piece was measured on the scales of penitence kept beside the scaffold. Equal weight signified a just division of guilt, according to temple law. When Darien Vex, a rebel prince, was executed in 1521, his quarters weighed almost identically, a feat that earned the executioner an additional 10 silver marks and a poem etched into the court's archive. Organs were burned in a specific order, reflecting medieval beliefs. The heart, symbol of loyalty, was always burned first. The liver, home of courage, was last, often removed while the victim still gasped. The lungs, seat of breath, were sometimes inflated in mockery before the crowd. The dao, tools themselves, held ritual significance. Execution ropes were woven with 13 strands symbolizing the king and the 12 apostles. Knives bore runes of damnation. Even the wood of the scaffold came from ironwood trees grown in cursed soil, according to royal superstition. No part of the act was random. It was theater, written in flesh, staged with steel, and watched in silence. Dr. Elric Brannan, a court physician present at multiple executions, recorded that hearts sometimes continued beating for 3 to 5 minutes after removal. He called it the last rebellion of the body. By the late 1500s, the best executioners were sought not for efficiency, but for their ability to prolong consciousness. They were rewarded in gold and fear. Names like Jackan the Whisper, Kale, and Torin Dirk were passed between townsfolk like curses, known for their uncanny ability to keep a man alive deep into his own dismantling. One apprentice famously recorded, "It is not enough that the body dies. It must learn what it did wrong and scream it as it falls apart." This was no longer just punishment, it was performance, doctrine, ritual, horror. In Castborn's most gruesome era, the execution of a traitor did not end with death. Instead, death was simply the prelude to a grander narrative of desecration. Every piece of the traitor's body had purpose. Every severed limb, every blackened organ, every tar-drenched head played a role in spreading fear, reinforcing power, and warning the masses. The crown forgets nothing. Once the condemned had been hanged, gutted, and quartered, the remains were not buried. They were sentenced to wander, distributed across the kingdom's furthest reaches as relics of betrayal. Take the case of Darien Vex, the rebellious noble executed in 1326. After his excruciating quartering, his limbs were dispatched to 4 cities, each chosen for symbolic relevance. Brightmere to the east, where he first rallied dissenters, Drayhollow to the west, where his family ruled, Seathorn Port to the south, facing distant kingdoms he once sought for alliance, Northwall Bastion, the kingdom's edge, where no traitor had ever reached alive. Each quarter was preserved meticulously, packed in cedar crates lined with salt and crushed rosemary, believed to stave off rot and purify the flesh of blasphemy. These boxes were guarded by soldiers and accompanied by a royal proclamation, read aloud in town squares by hornblowers and heralds. Let this be a lesson writ in bone and sinew. Those who defy the crown shall serve her still, in silence and in pieces. Heads received special treatment. Crimson Bridge spanning the River Thorn became the kingdom's infamous gallery of heads. From the 1200s to the 1700s, dozens of tarred, blackened skulls lined its iron posts. Before display, the heads were parboiled in salted water, dipped in pitch-black tar, and sometimes even painted with gold filigree mocking former titles. The process, performed by royal morticians, preserved facial features for months, so the condemned could be recognized long after their voice had vanished. The head of Lady Elira Montaigne, accused of treason in 1535, stayed on the bridge for nearly 30 days before her daughter bribed a bridge guard to retrieve it. Wrapped in cloth soaked in myrrh and lavender, the daughter kept her mother's skull in a silver box until her death. The box is still rumored to exist, hidden in the catacombs beneath the ruined Temple of Light. But not all remains were displayed equally. The kingdom drew a sharp distinction between noble and common flesh. Court records from 1586 detail the execution of the Emberroot plotters, in which 3 nobles and 4 peasants were disemboweled. The nobles' organs were burned in separate copper cauldrons, placed at different heights, reflecting their status even in death. The largest cauldron, named the King's Tongue, was reserved for hearts, considered the seat of treasonous thought. This macabre symbolism extended further. The heart was always burned first, destroying the soul's last anchor. The lungs, believed, to house breath and voice, were hung above the scaffold like banners. The liver, representing courage, was often removed last, while the victim still lived. Executioners often explained these actions to the crowd, like grim priests interpreting scripture. One of the most feared Tauric Dane was known for narrating the dissection. Here is the heart, where pride was born. Let it boil. Here are the lungs, whence treason breathed. Let them steam. Here is the liver, once brave, now treacherous. Let it crack. Such performances were terrifyingly effective. Even the tools held ritual significance. The axe used for quartering was carefully balanced, its weight adjusted over generations to maximize control and force. Rope makers wove nooses from 13 twisted cords, one for each apostle, with one dyed black for the betrayer. Royal archives reveal that iron spikes used to mount heads were measured to exact lengths, 7.7 inches, for optimal height above eye level. The Guild of Headkeepers, a real organization employed by the Crown, was responsible for maintaining the display, replacing decomposed heads, and even cleaning the pikes with vinegar and lye. It was a job passed through families, feared yet oddly. respected. The kingdom's belief system further fueled this grotesque order. Each organ was said to house a specific sin. The spleen was rage, the gallbladder, bitterness, the intestines, corruption. Thus, public burning was not merely disposal, it was ritual purification, a way to cleanse the land of what one man had stained. By the 1600s, this display culture had become so entrenched that foreign envoys dreaded visiting Castborn. A traveling scholar from the court of Zevrath wrote, "Their bridges bear skulls like torches. Their towers weep entrails. They call it justice, but it is horror painted in daylight." Indeed, Castborn's justice system was not merely about verdicts, it was about vanishing identity. In life, the traitor had a name. In death, they became a lesson. Their parts scattered across the map. Their voice burned away. Their legacy nailed to the bones of a kingdom built on obedience. By the turn of the 14th century, Castborn's most infamous executions had become legends, etched not only in parchment, but in whispered prayers, haunted ruins, and rebel songs. These were not nameless criminals, but men and women who had risen to challenge the throne, and whose agonizing deaths were staged as cautionary tales. Their fates were drawn in fire, their memories carved in steel. One such tale begins at dawn, on the 23rd day of harvest fall, in the year 1305. The streets of Smith Cross Market buzzed with anticipation for Wayland Ward, the wild northerner who had defied Castborn's rule for nearly a decade, was to meet his end. To some, he was a traitor. To others, a hero. Captured near Highglen Hollow by Sir John Menther, who received 40 silver crests for the betrayal, Wayland had spent his final days in the Stone Maw, a cell beneath the Tower of Arden known for its icy walls and echoing screams. Guards later reported finding Celtic symbols and crosses scratched into the stone with his bare fingernails, proof that even stripped of weapons, his spirit never bent. His execution would be the most elaborate the realm had ever seen. According to the Lost Scrolls of Verdane, Wayland was dragged behind 4 horses rather than 1, through a winding 4-mile route across the capital. The cart, constructed of fresh greenheart oak, was built not for mercy, but to withstand the struggle of a defiant man. Streets were lined with soldiers and throngs of commoners, who had been ordered, under threat of penalty, to witness the event. Merchants closed shop, children perched on rooftops, and nobles watched from balconies embroidered with royal gold. The route itself had symbolic weight. Wayland was pulled past the site of his first rebellion, then through the square where his supporters were executed, and finally to Smith Cross, where a scaffold had been built so high no one could claim not to have seen. Before the crowd, executioner Tom of Litherpool, trained by 3 generations of blood-hardened headsmen, followed a strict sequence meant to prolong both the suffering and the spectacle. Records indicate Tom was paid 4 times the standard rate, 20 gold, cents for mastery of technique and composure. Wayland remained defiant to the end. Chronicler Brother Mathan of Plusfold, disguised as a merchant in the crowd, recorded that Wayland sang for Flame and Stone, a Highland folk hymn, as the noose choked his voice. The song echoed through the market until cut short by the air Blade. His death took over 4 hours, but it would not be the last of such legendary ends. When the Ashfire conspiracy was discovered in 1605, one of its key conspirators, Leorin Falk, a fiery-minded alchemist, was captured and taken to the Tower of Arden. His interrogation lasted 8 days in the Queen's chambers, where he was stretched on the rack, beaten with barbed cords, and forced to write his confession with broken fingers. The original parchment still survives in the royal archives, his first words bold and sharp, the last lines shaking and blood-stained. Leorin, along with 2 co-conspirators, was housed in a chamber called the Ember Cell, later renamed the Powdermen's Vault. Before the execution, Falk reportedly joked with guards about the quality of his own stolen explosives, saying, "Had I made the charges myself, none of us would be here." On the day of execution, the condemned were arranged so that each one would witness the deaths of the others. It was not just punishment, it was performance. Falk was third in line, He watched his comrades hang, writhe, and be gutted before his turn came. But in a final act of defiance, now legend, Leorin threw himself from the gallows ladder before the rope tightened, snapping his own neck and robbing the kingdom of its performance. Furious, the High Magistrate ordered his corpse still be quartered, and the part sent to the four corners of Castbourne. Even in death, his defiance echoed. Other executions blurred the line between punishment and martyrdom. The death of Arundor Callan, a scholarly priest executed in 1581 for translating forbidden texts, drew a crowd of 20,000. A raised gallery was built just to accommodate the nobles and foreign dignitaries. Arundor gave what became known as the scaffold sermon, speaking for nearly an hour before being silenced by the blade. His executioner, Jarrick Bull, was so moved by the priest's words that he later converted to Arundor's outlawed faith. According to the Black Diary of Inquisitor, Reims now kept in the Cathedral of Veilglass, fragments of Arundor's robe, torn by witnesses and hidden away, were passed down through secret congregations as relics of resistance. In 1571, when Councillor Jaron Stowe was executed for aligning with the enemy court of Velmaris, the symbolism grew even darker. The rope used in his hanging was imported from southern Safine, known for its unbreakable hemp. According to Tower Clerk, Stowe's heart beat for 7 full minutes after being removed, an event some claimed was divine intervention. Then there was Desmond Dyer, better known as the king's bastard brother, whose execution in 1499 was sealed by King Orwyn IV himself. Locked in a cell facing only the sunlit wall of the tower, Dyer spent 14 years in silence, carving poetry with fishbone into the stone. When he was finally executed, the king gave specific instructions that Dyer should remain conscious until the final limb was severed. The executioner used rosewater and vinegar to revive him between mutilations. His death took over 2 hours, the crowd eerily silent throughout. From Wayland Ward to Leorin Falk, from Arundor Callan to Desmond Dyer, their deaths shaped the cultural memory of Castbourne. They were paraded as traitors, but remembered by many as saints, rebels, and heroes. Their blood soaked the streets, their bones crowned the bridges, but their stories, whispered, sung, and inked into hidden scrolls, never died. As the centuries advanced and Castbourne's empire grew in might and intellect, the once festive roar that echoed through execution squares began to fade into murmurs of disgust. The spectacle of agony, once a sacred rite of royal justice, now stirred something new in the hearts of the people: doubt. Back in 1571, crowds numbering over 50,000 packed Tyburn Row to watch the public execution of High Scribe Jareth Stone, a loyalist turned heretic. Vendors hawked honeymead and skewered meats. Children clung to their mothers' cloaks. It was more festival than funeral. But by the close of the 1700s, the air had changed. In 1783, at the final public execution held at Ironmere Yard, royal diarist Lady Vesra Montclair wrote, "Not cheers now, but shivers." The crowd leans back. A lady fainted before the rope was drawn. The children cry. Perhaps the age of terror ends. The great unraveling, as historians would later call it, was not born from mercy, but from philosophy. The age of ink and lantern, an intellectual revival that swept through Castbourne in the late 17th century, began to question everything the crown held sacred. It started with stories. The execution of Rorik Dame, a foreign diplomat butchered for allegedly smuggling anti-monarchist scripts. The execution was so horrifying that Verlo the Blind, a traveling bard, wrote a poem so powerful it was banned within days. His limbs we knew, for we saw them all. His eyes still stared as his name they called. That poem circulated in whispers. Then came the essays, the pamphlets, the philosophical treatises. The most influential of them, The Law Beyond Blood, penned in 1758 by legal scholar Jalen Morwen, argued, "Justice is not born in entrails or proven in screams. To preserve a nation, we must preserve our own souls." Foreign outrage added, "Fire." In 1757, across the sea in Varelia, the infamous execution of Farlan Damier, an attempted assassin of their emperor, involved near-identical methods to Castbourne's. Witnesses wept. Scholars protested. It sparked outrage so powerful that even King Horrified of Castborn received diplomatic letters demanding moral reconsideration. That same year, philosopher Elvin Drex, writing from his estate near Duskwater, warned, "We now break the body, but soon we shall break the spirit of the kingdom." The tipping point came in 1772, when Judge Emmerich Balefort published a public critique of the execution code, citing inhuman consistency. He revealed that, of 167 executions over the previous 2 decades, only 3 had actually followed the full ritual of hanging, gutting, and quartering. Most were commuted, quietly shortened, or altogether dismissed. Behind closed doors, lawmakers whispered what reformers shouted. The old ways were dying. Castborn was changing, but not alone. In Varelia, the Wheel of Bones was banned in 1789. In Valamar, pyre executions were halted by royal decree. Yet Castborn clung to its legacy, torn between pride and progress. The Code of Crimson Sins, which once listed over 200 crimes punishable by death, began to unravel. In 1810, Councilman Romer Seil argued before Parliament, "Let us not adorn the gallows while tearing our society limb from limb. A nation rises by dignity, not dread." By 1820, only 1 person had been sentenced to the full punishment in 20 years, and even that sentence was quietly altered. Public outcry rose with every whisper of revival, and still the symbols of the past loomed. The scaffold still stood. The hooks on Crimson Bridge still held old rusted spikes. The tools of division, locked away in the vaults beneath Tower Eldros, were still polished once a year, in case tradition returns. But the public was no longer watching in awe. They watched in horror. And in their silence, a revolution stirred, not with blades but with pens, votes, and law. By the dawn of the 19th century, Castborn's brutal form of execution, once the empire's signature of power, had become a source of national shame. The punishment of hanging, gutting, and quartering, once sacred and celebrated, now stood at odds with the world Castborn claimed to lead. It wasn't just citizens who rebelled against it. It was parliamentarians, philosophers, physicians, and poets. In 1832, the Reform Concord, a wave of progressive legislators swept into the Hall of Lords and shifted the tone of debate. Among them, Baron Thalist Marin, a former military judge turned legal reformist, delivered a fiery speech before the council. "We wear silk upon our robes, yet demand the tearing of flesh. We speak of empire, yet cling to barbarity. If Castborn is to lead the world, let it first lead itself beyond this horror." That same year, the Justice Chronicle of Eldros published damning statistics. From 1740 to 1760, 38 executions used the full ritual. From 1760 to 1800, only 9. From 1800 to 1830, only 1. More in turn, a foreign agent caught selling secrets to rival kingdoms. Even that final act left the crowd in stunned silence. No cheers, no chants, just retching. The shift was driven by thinkers as much as lawmakers. Alric Thendwell, a prison reformer who had visited the dungeons of Ravel's Gate, published On the Misery of Judgment, detailing the psychological decay of condemned prisoners. He described one inmate kept alive for 3 weeks with open wounds from a failed execution rehearsal. These findings fueled the rise of the Gentle Justice League, an alliance of clergy, midwives, surgeons, and magistrates. Their argument was simple: pain does not teach, fear does not civilize, death should not entertain. By 1845, even the royal family could not ignore the storm. Foreign dignitaries from the neighboring realms of Valamar, Harland, and Safinia expressed horror that Castborn still maintained the medieval sentence. Ambassador Marielle Foyer of Harland, in her correspondence, described the tradition as an iron noose upon the throat of a kingdom now built of glass and gold. But the final blow came not from protest, but embarrassment. In 1858, when Alston Varick, a rebel tied to an assassination attempt on the Emperor of Varelia, was captured, the crown prepared for full execution. Yet when news of the plan leaked to the Varelian court, international outcry erupted. Even the League of Unified Nations, a diplomatic body formed to prevent cross-empire bloodshed, condemned the sentence. Faced with diplomatic collapse, Castborn relented. Varick was hanged quietly at dawn, his body buried without display. That moment birthed the Punishment Reformation Act of 1859, pushed by Lady Halwyn Truss, a noblewoman whose own brother had been executed years earlier under dubious charges. The act eliminated the practice of disemboweling and quartering. It permitted only standard hanging, no fanfare, no torture, no theater. But the final nail came in 1870 under the Civic Redemption Edict, led by Lord Chancellor Remer Locke. He stood before Parliament and said, "Let us be the generation that closes the book, not with fire, but with ink. Let us write an ending that does not drip with blood." The law passed by overwhelming majority. The gallows of Smith Cross were dismantled. The scaffolds of Tyburn were burned. The tools of division, once preserved in velvet-lined boxes, were melted into the peace bell of Tower Eldros, which still rings every year on the anniversary of abolition. And yet, the memory endured. In a quiet ledger beneath the Justice Hall, a clerk wrote, "The last man sentenced to be hanged, gutted, and quartered was Alston Varick. He was not disemboweled, he was not divided, he simply died." And the world moved on. The reign of horror had ended, not with fire and screaming, but with a signature. The punishment of hanging, gutting, and quartering is gone from Castborn. The blood has dried. The gallows are dust. The pikes that once pierced skulls now rust beneath vines. And yet the shadow of that horror still lingers like a whisper in the stones of Tower Eldros, or in the scorched wood of old execution yards. What remains is memory, raw, reluctant, but unforgotten. We no longer drag traitors through streets. We no longer boil hearts in cauldrons or crown men with nettles. But to believe that such brutality is dead forever is to forget the lesson these centuries offer. Cruelty is not born in law, it's born in fear, and law simply gives it a mask. The execution of Wayland Ward, who sang as his flesh was torn, now lives on in the songs of Highland rebels. The hanging of Arundor Callan, who forgave his tormentors, is whispered in forbidden temples. The dismemberment of Desmond Dyer, who wrote poems into the stone walls of his cell, is taught in schools not as a crime, but as a cry for change. Their stories, once buried beneath tar and silence, are now etched in books, echoed in ballads, and burned into the national soul. What once was a warning to dissenters has become a warning to rulers. Power may claim the body, but not the voice, not the memory, not the meaning. Even the final line of the Civic Redemption Edict did not celebrate reform. It mourned what it took to reach it. Let this be the last we raise the blade against the helpless. Let this be the day we cease to teach obedience through agony. Today the peace bell still tolls each year, not in celebration, but in reflection. Its echo sweeps through the streets of a kingdom that once painted its power in red. It rings, for every voice silenced, every breath stolen beneath the noose, and every life shattered not by crime, but by vengeance cloaked in ritual. The butcher's stage has fallen, but what it taught us must stand, that justice without mercy becomes theater, that punishment without conscience becomes legacy, that silence does not mean peace, and screams are never truly forgotten. So we close the pages of this harrowing chapter, in Castborn's history, but not to forget, to remember, and never return.